So today we are talking to Rob Brill, who is a re-recording mixer in the advertising world and the film world. Also comes from music with a relatively high-level background working with people like Stevie Nicks and Paul McCartney, which I guess he's a returning client, right? Not something people can say across the board usually. It's kind of cool. Who else have you worked with in that realm?
Oh boy. It's been a couple of decades, so I've had a lot of pretty interesting acts I've worked with, from Etta James, Marilyn Manson, The Strokes, Sugar Ray, a lot of varying acts, I suppose. Kelly Clarkson.
Kelly Clarkson's a big one.
God, some of these names elude me. It's been so long.
There's so many. No, certainly.
I've had a pretty good run in that area. I got my start delivering gear for a company called Design Effects back in the early 90s. And one of the things that really excited me about that company was that they had a remote truck where they would pull up to different venues and record concerts and whatnot. We did Coachella, stuff like that, the Eagles at the Rose Bowl.
Sure. When did Coachella start? Were you at some of the first?
I was at the first 5 years.
You were the first 5 years of Coachella?
Yeah.
That's some history making in the music world.
So Scott Peets there, he liked me because I played ice hockey on my resume there. And started working for that company.
How'd you get into music? Well, I was playing hockey.
Yeah. But, go figure, that would get me my first gig.
Sure.
So delivered gear, did what I could to get on the truck, pulling cables and, anything I could do to learn the equipment in and out. I was doing minor repairs on the gear. And ultimately, after years there, made the transition to a studio, the Complex Studios in West LA. Built by George Massenburg, had two of his consoles. We know George Massenburg EQs, the shiny, multicolored knobs and whatnot, very surgical EQs. So that place, I believe, was built for Earth, Wind, and Fire.
Okay.
So that was a good place to learn. Worked on a lot of records there. And there we were mostly using 2-inch tape, 24-track, and we saw the tides turning to, multi-track recorders, the Sony PCM 3348, 48-track half-inch digital tape.
Sure.
And after that a little bit, you had Pro Tools coming in on stuff, so it was, you were syncing up the tape machines with the digital machines to the Pro Tools and stuff like that.
I guess seeing the transition that happened in film too, more recently, I think, than in the music world, that everybody transitioned from these big tape machines running, 5 of them synced up at once, 10 of them synced up at once, and just these crazy linked arrays, into now we're running on some of the flagship stages. We see, 2 Pro Tools rigs that are handling 70 times the amount that any one of these tape machines could at any given time. I just think it's fascinating to see the leaps and bounds of technology.
Yeah.
So you had to deal with the shift from analog tape to digital, and then kind of weirdly back and finding a medium there, because that's still used a lot.
Well, yeah, people didn't want to lose the warmth of analog, so people would track, you'd track your bass and drums to tape, maybe more, and then you dump it into Pro Tools, where it's a lot easier to edit. Back then, the Pro Tools rigs were it was just touch-up stuff. It was just, there were very few dudes who were, around town that could really use one of the rigs. Right. Nobody was recording to them.
I don't know that I'd be able to function.
Yeah, when I left the Complex and I went to Conway Studios, and that was, they had a lot bigger records being done there, a lot more money to be spent on records, and that's when you were seeing, bigger Pro Tools rigs coming in on stuff, and actual Pro Tool editors that would be on a record, and their sole purpose was to do all the editing, because the engineer or mixer at that time wasn't hip to all that stuff.
Right.
So you always had a Pro Tools guy.
It's interesting. There are certain aspects of that kind of still stick around in the post world too, where you have a mixer, a re-recording mixer, or a sound supervisor whose job it is to kind of manifest everything into exactly the right workflows, exactly the right sounds, and then they have people around them who are kind of responsible for making it happen. On big feature dub stages, you have a mixer or two mixers, and then you have a mix tech whose job it is to kind of make the room work around these guys.
Well, there were definitely a lot of the, I guess you'd call them old school engineers that, if you're not learning that stuff, record budgets started, getting smaller and smaller. So you had to take on more responsibility and learn stuff. So, the first producer that I really worked with through most of my career was David Kahn. And he was so prolific in electronic, instruments, and he was a Logic user. So my first platform was Logic,
Okay.
which was much more in-depth than Pro Tools at that time. Where Pro Tools it was just a tape machine. But the MIDI functions were,
Lacking?
not that great. And the setup we had, or his setup at Henson Recording, you had about 50 separate modules being triggered by MIDI through Logic and various templates and stuff like that.
Very complex at the time.
Yeah.
It's still to some degree complex. It's not exactly a necessarily commonplace thing when composing music at this point.
No, most people are using, Giga Studio, Giga Sampler type programs and keeping everything in one box. That's become, with the processor speed and everything becoming what it is now, you can do that. But David had, some of the first, Giga computers. He had, custom chassis with 4 PCs in them running programs and
all
string sounds
working off of each other at once and synced together, and
it was archaic at the time, but it worked, and we had a pretty insane setup that he was using there over at Henson.
Sure. I mean, that's also one of those things that I want to talk about it now just because you mentioned it, and we'll get into this a little bit further later, but I feel like in the music world versus the post-production world, which again, you're now working at a major studio, you're working on advertising campaigns that millions, if not billions of people around the world see and hear. In the music world, I feel like there's a lot more of the, does it sound good? It is good. Don't worry about how we got there as we're getting there. Just figure out how to document it after the fact and we'll go with it. Whereas the post world is so much more structured around workflow, and you will do it this way. It's regimented. It's very, it's much more formulaic to a degree.
I think with post, it's just time, especially with marketing campaigns being what they are. You could get 6 or 7 spots out, so you're not necessarily able to create new sounds per se on a campaign, because people at that point, when you're finishing a spot, they just want it mixed.
They're going to deliver everything over to you, and it's your responsibility to balance all of those existing materials. Yeah, there's not a lot of...
what you'll find in post-production too is a lot of people get demo-itis. They think that their way is the only way it can sound good or whatever, and you want to keep true. I mean, they're your clients, they're your bread and butter. So you don't want to stray too far for it. But once you build a relationship with the client, that's when you can, you might be able to take a few liberties and stuff like that.
Sure. People get really attached to the things that they're familiar with as they're working. And so you get a lot of the, this was in the temp sound effects that we just tossed in as placeholders. Well, we've grown to like them, and we want to make sure that those really poke through. And those may be terrible sound effects.
Yeah.
But if you're familiar with them, they're known quantity. It's sort of the devil I guess.
Yeah. It's from the music industry. It was like, you get a cassette tape of a song, and, here you are in a multi-million-dollar studio, and you're trying to make it as good as you can. But the band likes, they like that bass tone. They like that guitar sound or whatever. And, you got to try and recreate that, or, they don't want it different.
Right. Looking at how that same mentality translates into post, people will spend, months, years cutting a feature film. And if you don't have anybody in the room saying, hey, try this sound, or hey, if you tighten this up, thinking about sound in a way that's going to benefit picture, you're limited to what your options are at the time. And people talk about how a sound editor is only as good as their library. And while that's not entirely true, you are very much limited to what you're working with at the time and the sounds you're selecting at the time. So it would make sense then that you find the things that you really like and you don't want to deviate too far.
Right. That's why people hire people with a lot of experience.
Right.
They want their bag of tricks. They want their bag of sounds.
Sure.
And then, they trust that with experience, the product is going to be good. And also what we have to do as mixers and engineers and editors is we have to remember we're still telling a story. That's the most important part. Are we taking away from the story?
Right.
That's the most kick-ass snare sound I've ever heard. Yeah, but it's all over the vocal. Nobody's gonna, oh, hey, man, that pop song, I really like that kick drum. It was, it's not gonna happen.
Yeah, that one tambourine really made that track.
It's, more cowbell. It's no.
I do have a fever.
No. And what I learned in mixing coming up is that, you'd see guys set up a mix and they'd be working on a kick drum for half the day. And it's, where's the vocal in all this? Where's the dialogue on the picture? We're building stuff around it. We don't want so much stuff going on in the surround speakers or the Atmos that it's distracting you from the dialogue.
I think that's one of the biggest mistakes in trying to break into sound in some capacity is you have all of this possibility.
Yeah.
And so you're tempted to use all of that possibility. You're tempted to maximize, if you have a 7.1 surround system, well, let's pan everything everywhere. We got to fill the space.
Right.
And you very rarely actually end up needing to do something like that unless there's a specific purpose to call the audience's attention or the viewer's attention to something behind them.
Yeah.
Or imply that something is going on off screen.
I mean, if you're, looking for an example, like, the Fast and Furious films, a great example of where you do want to fill that theater.
Sure.
With information. I mean, that's great. And it gets pulled back at the right time. So, the story unfolds.
And you get that contrast that, feature the things that will tell the story the best and demand to be heard the most at the times that they're necessary, and dial them back when they're not.
Yeah.
So that you have that contrast, and when something needs to be big, you have a sonic space to put those huge things in. Because if everything is big and huge and loud and crazy, nothing is going to stand out.
Yeah, you need dynamics in a picture, and I guess that's the storyline too. Is the beginning, middle, end.
Right.
You have varying degrees of energy.
So in the advertising world, I feel like this is actually sort of a departure from that to a degree, because a lot of marketing campaigns, it's more about, I like to just call it clubbing you over the head with sound, because it's just, we want it all loud, we want it all the time, it's got to be impactful, it's got to be crazy, and we've got to tell whatever story we're trying to convey in the span of 20 seconds, 30 seconds.
That's a tough one, because usually, the dialogue you're working with is whispers, and yet you've got a bed of storm drums and orchestra and lasers and and gunshots.
We're doing ASMR with Hans Zimmer scoring our...
It's that, why can't I hear that? Well, that's a whisper over Claymore mines going off. It just, that's very difficult. And you get a lot of people too, in marketing TV spots that, you get an offline mix from an editor who hasn't had any time to mix it correctly. They're just slapping it together and trying to meet their deadlines.
Right.
So you're getting a distorted, blown out 2-track mix to go by.
I have to wonder if there's maybe a little bit of a disconnect in both workflow and communication on that side of things, because that could very easily be solved by calibrating a listening environment on the picture editor's end, so that all their ideas could then translate properly into the sound side of things. And whatever it is they establish, they're in a listening environment that when something is really unbelievably loud, it's going to hurt physically. And so they'll dial it back and it'll sit more in the pocket.
Yeah. They don't have a standard in their room. Say I might listen at 72. dB or something like that. In my room, they're up, down, up, down, up, down, and I think that takes away a lot. And also, they need to learn the golden rule. If it's red, bring it back a notch there, cowboy. That's doing nobody any good.
Wait, red is bad then?
Red is bad. Coming out of the Avid, red is bad.
Well, when it comes to modern pop music, I've always thought that clipping is good and sausage-looking audio is the way you want to go. So you're telling me that that's incorrect.
Not the most pleasant thing. You can listen to some rock tracks mixed by Andy Wallace, and you can see the dynamics in his mixes. You can see that from the beginning of the song to the end of the song, it's getting louder, and he pushes each chorus a little more. He does things very individualistic within his mix. It's fascinating, and there's headroom. And
what's that
exactly? And that's when we get to TV mixes, as you said, just a square wave going across. It doesn't sound good,
right?
But if that's what the client wants, then that's what they get. It just doesn't really play well, in my opinion. But you have a lot of clients too that respect your experience and what you do, and what sounds good to you, and you can be honest with those clients and say, hey, I think this is a little hot here. I think this might, let's bring this up, bring that down.
Sure.
And we can make the tail end hits bigger if we kind of mellow some other stuff down.
Yeah, it's a sound is always a give and take when it comes to even cutting sounds into place against picture and making selections. Like my favorite example is always a gunshot or a car or something like it, just because it's easy to conceptualize. But to make a Hollywood gun cinematic, you've got to have more movement. You've got to have a little bit of the slide actuation. A trigger or hammer sound locking it's just gonna give that little bit of detail of the mechanisms, as well as the actual gunshot. And I think one of the most commonly used techniques to get the explosions sounding right is to layer some kind of big distant cannon-y, thunder crack sort of deal with a lot of nice rumbles to tail everything out, and then get that sort of big impactful, it's almost a pop, I guess.
Yeah.
If you
nothing like a real gunshot.
Oh, absolutely not.
It's become this massive nuclear explosion, and if you actually go to the gun range, you'll be very disappointed if that's what you want to hear.
We're not selling reality, we're selling the idea of what you're supposed to be experiencing were you to be in that situation. I totally understand that play back and forth.
Yeah.
I think it's really important for people working with picture, and especially working with a sound team, to have that kind of collaboration and cohesion of understanding, where if you give something a little bit more level in one spot, you're going to have to take something away to feature it. If you're working against some kind of specification, like Netflix has its loudness standards, you have Spotify and Apple Music have their own loudness standards. Television in general has its own loudness standards, and that's why people spend so much time in real mix spaces getting these things dialed in. Is because, if you're putting something out on YouTube, it's the Wild West. The internet doesn't have any specifications. As soon as you hit broadcast, we want something at minus 24 LKFS plus or minus 2 dB. What does that even mean to most people? And that's not even including true peak and all the Dolby and ITU measurements and all the rest of that, jargon, I guess. It becomes important to think about those things from a conceptual standpoint, even if you don't know the actual specifications, or you don't want to get that technical. And I think there's the more understanding that everybody in part of the process on the post side of things has, the more cohesively an idea is going to flow from a director to a picture editor to a sound supervisor to a mixer to the audience. On that note, one of the biggest differences, I think, in the post workflow versus the music workflow, there are no standards for anything. There are like workflow tricks and tips that you can kind of integrate and people will use commonly, and there are tools that you use commonly, but there's no standard for it's got to be this loud, it's got to be this quiet, it's got to be, panned in this direction versus that. It's got to be, down mixed from 5.1 surround into stereo. It's music. You make it sound good, you make it fill the dynamic range that you need it to, and you try and make it competitive in loudness to whatever else is on the market. Whereas post is very, again, regimented in that, to the point that they have standards specifically for how loud or how quiet you can have your mixes be. And if you fall outside of those parameters, there are actually organizations dedicated to checking this stuff that they'll kick it back to you.
Yeah.
And tell you, no, this is wrong.
Yeah, there's definitely a major shift from music to the post world that, you know, an entirely different language and set of standards, where music, you just make it sound good. You know, 90s metal and stuff like that, it was like, get it hot, get it crunchy, you know, things like that. But you could deliver it zero, you know, digital, right. and that was that.
Like rammed up against meters and nobody would bat an eye.
Yeah, where, you know, most classic rock, you know, you got a lot of room on your knob to crank it up. Going into post, what do the numbers mean? What do they, you know, what do the specs mean? You spend a lot of time going through deliverables. Now we have YouTube, now we have Snapchat, you know, we have Instagram and, right. you know, iTunes and stuff like that. And everybody's got a little bit of a quirky little change on the specs.
Yeah, so you're mixing pieces that will go to all of these things.
Correct. So we
oftentimes at the same time.
Yeah.
So you have to deal with every different standard and specification at once and get one mix translating between all the platforms.
Yeah, and you have to get it right. You don't want stuff getting kicked back to you at 4 a.m. when something has to air or something has to be uploaded. You have to make sure that it's correct.
Right. And that's another thing. You're oftentimes right up against deadlines that are, hey, this, you know, there's an advertising buy for the Super Bowl that cost whatever company, you know, $15 million for that 30 seconds worth of time.
Yeah.
We only get one shot at this. And you have to have it on time. You have to have it done right. It needs to translate. We need to know that it's going to translate. How do you, I mean, if there's a breakdown in the process, how do you approach something like that?
You know, in the mix template, you know, that I'm using, you know, we have separate outputs. We have a broadcast output. We have an online output, and we provide splits. So if somebody really has to break it apart and put it back together for something, a wild specification, we deliver all that.
Right. So you've got separate narration, you've got separate dialogue that's just a couple of tracks of just that, yep. and it's all routed within your template that...
It's going to be getting the same EQ as the stereo mix would. Everything's going to be affected the same. So in theory, you just slap it together and there's your mix. Right. I've found that in doing that, it never quite comes back 100%. And I've seen people in side chaining and automating and doing everything they can to actually make those splits come back together, and it never quite happens. I'm finding more that getting the specs right on your stereo mix or your 5.1, and that's going to be used. You're good with that.
Sure. So loudness standards are certainly not the most exciting component of the workflow. In terms of, well, let's talk a little bit about difference in workflow. When it comes to music, you have a very different process of tracking a song, capturing every little detail of it, mixing it, and then doing, you know, whatever processing that you're going to do, whether it's analog, digital, you do all of that, and then you have some sort of, I don't know, final mixing stage, mastering stage, and it goes out into the world. Versus post, there's a totally different...
Well, you're handed an OMF or an AAF, a file with all your audio, and it's good to be mixed. You get your QuickTime, you put those together in your template, and you mix it. Whereas, back in music, you could be weeks in pre-production working on songs and kind of figuring out, with the producer, what's this going to sound like? What are we doing with this? Working on tempos, orchestration, and whatnot. And then you go to the record phase, you get everybody in, and hopefully, a good studio, a nice studio, track, edit, overdub, add all the bells and whistles, as it were,
sure.
To the song that you would want. And then it's off to be mixed. After it's mixed, it's mastered, and then sent out.
Right. Are you finding that between those two workflows, there are some techniques or skills that you find yourself using in both?
When I'm mixing in post, I'm still using faders, where I think, I like to have, I think it gives it more of a dynamic vibe to it. I think it's a little more as you would want to hear it,
It's a little more
rides on
organic.
dialect. Yeah,
It's a little more
I
organic.
would say there's 1,000 ways to skin a cat. There's
Certainly.
so many different ways, and I think some people get hung up on a certain way, and that's the only way. And we have so much available to us within Pro Tools. You can
kind of do whatever you want.
Yeah,
It's a sandbox.
yeah. And then again, it's like I don't try to get caught up on that. Sound goes in, sound comes out. Let's make it sound good. I don't care which way it's happening.
Right.
I'll do my best to make it sound good.
It's people who kind of have that understanding of it's the priority is making this sound great. Let's not, if they have the ability or they have the luxury to rely on somebody to handle all the technical details for them, that makes for a better combination, a better team environment, because you have people who are great at what they do in each of those respects, hopefully, doing what they're best at. And you can have a mixer who's entirely focused on dialogue and balancing dialogue against the music and making all that sound great. Then you have a mixer who's entirely focused on sound effects, making those work against everything. And then you have somebody who's entirely there to support that workflow and make sure that sound's coming out the right speakers and stuff's bussed the right ways and, the right sounds are in the right spots, etc. Yeah. So it's I feel like the more people are involved in each different component, there's a lot more opportunity to make each of those components great.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not having to carry the whole weight of a film on your back, all better. It's specialized work, specialized workflow. Yeah, and even that, I mean, that's such a symbiotic relationship between those guys, on the stage, working together, knowing how to work together, knowing what the client wants. And yeah, the recordist, I mean, he plays such a major part in keeping everything together, keeping takes, reels, the record machines, making sure everything's routed correctly.
I feel like that's something that people don't even realize exists, is a person dedicated to doing that in our modern digital age.
Well, in back when I was making records, I mean, that's you as an assistant engineer. You're making sure that everything is working, documented, the integrity of all the settings is kept, safe, and it's a very unsung hero in the room for sure.
Right.
And also if one of the mixers, God forbid something happens, that person's probably going to be able to pop up there and fill in.
Right.
That was the idea in a recording studio, is if, the mixer drops dead in front of you, you can hop up and finish the mix.
Just shove his body off to the side. Don't worry, we got the take. It's fine.
We'll
deal with him later.
Push the warm corpse over. There's a lot that goes on in the post world that's definitely, I think, flies under the radar. Is even career opportunities, like of ways to get in there.
Sure.
As a mix technician or, a recordist, things like that. I mean, there's a lot of talented cats out there.
When I was getting started in this, I was only looking at feature films. I wanted to work on feature films, and that was it. And I got tunnel vision doing that. And over time, I'd started working on short films when I was first breaking in, and I started getting more features and started getting a little bit more of the longer form, like episodic sort of stuff. And then the big break for me came from basically landing a job recording and mastering and managing the sound effects library for a major theatrical studio. And I didn't even know that somebody was dedicated to doing that, let alone how much time and effort and energy it would take to facilitate something like that for their team of, 50 to 80 to 100 plus sound effects editors who are constantly saying, I need this needs to be better, I need more options for that, these sound effects are old, we want something a little bit more fresh, hey, this stuff isn't quite as clean, we need to have somebody go out and recapture stuff. It's just a whole it's a whole other world.
Yeah, I mean, having a dedicated person that's actually, in a moment's notice can go hop out there with a recorder and record stuff properly too.
Yep.
It's not just recording it, it's getting it done properly.
Right.
I mean, anybody can record a drum set. Can they keep phase correct? Can they, look for issues of bleed, things like of that nature?
And if something breaks, are they knowledgeable enough to fix whatever it is and get the right sound out of it?
Yeah, working, one of the biggest things I think in a studio as an assistant was, that channel's not working. How do we work around it? How do we replace it? How do we move on? How do we keep the session rolling so there's no downtime? Sure. The dreaded downtime. Nobody wants to hear that word. That's a bad one. As you were just alluding to, it's like when I was, mixing, recording records, and then that industry, mid 2000s started drying up for me and a lot of other people. I didn't even think of post until I realized a friend worked at a trailer company and was like, "Hey, do you want to cut radio spots?" I had no idea. And, I hopped in there, and I didn't even think that would be an option to me with having done records.
Right.
Like I had. And it turns out that, there's so many similarities, in mixing a record, mixing a spot. You find, the same components and what's important. Your output is different. But, this has been a really big leap for me that's been very rewarding. I enjoy my time in this industry, and I'm fortunate enough that I'm using the tools that I learned in music and brought them over here to post.
Right.
Because I'm not recording as much as I was, obviously, but the mixing part and learning fixes like and editing skills and things of that nature, because the re-recording mixer now, say on marketing spots, you're doing all the editing on the fly, you're doing music fixes, you're doing tons of dialogue edit fixes.
Yeah, it's kind of a single person show. You're doing every component of the workflow.
Exactly.
Where ordinarily on like a big feature or a long form, episodic sort of thing, you have, again, like 5 or 6 people.
Support.
Right.
You have a support staff. This is kind of Wild West. You've got one dude in the seat, and he's responsible for all those things. Not only is he responsible, he's got to be quick.
Right.
You got to be quick at it, and you got to be able to deliver that to the client. They expect things to go smoothly and quickly.
Sure.
And so many skills I picked up making records, have translated and have saved my butt a lot of times, where I don't think, say, someone that didn't spend that much time making records would actually have that skill.
That's actually one of the more interesting things. You were one of the few that I know of that went into music and also had a college degree. A lot of people who have, went and climbed the engineering ladder that at least I've heard of or am familiar with their reputations or their stories, many of them didn't go that route. And
no, I went to the University of Denver and had a degree in literature.
Literature?
Yeah.
Wow.
Go figure.
What happened?
I know. And I took one recording class at UCLA, and I just said, this is what I'm going to do. And this is, I'd worked with friends' bands and, doing live sound poorly, lots of feedback and stuff. And I wanted to be better, and I wanted to attack this and get in there. And, when I got back from college, the day after, I was hitting up studios, and I was doing all that groundwork and back to working at Design Effects. That was my big break there.
Sure.
Scott Peets, Gary Ladinsky, they took me in, and that's where the real education started. A lot of people now it's a wonderful luxury to have all these recording schools. And, I know some of my colleagues in that industry, Joe Barisi, he has a pro sound workshop where, he brings in aspiring engineers, and, he's shown them firsthand of what the big dogs do.
Right.
I think, with making records too, is you were always able to go up to the elder engineers and mixers and get feedback. There's always the guys that they don't want to talk to you, or they want to keep all their stuff secret. But you find the really great guys, without the egos, they're going to share what they can because they know how you might EQ a vocal isn't how they EQ a vocal, and back and forth. Everything is between the individual's ears.
Right. It's you can hand 10 different mixers the exact same tools, the exact same mix template, the exact same sounds, and tell them mix, whatever, mix this feature, mix this advertising campaign, mix whatever, and you'll get 10 different mixes.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same EQs, the same, compressors, that type of thing. Everybody's going to hear it a little bit different, and that makes it wonderful, too. It's not just everything is just hand, stamp, stamp, stamp.
Right.
And also, I don't think I want to be the mixer that he's got that one definitive sound. I think I want to be the guy that he makes it all sound good.
And you can adapt to...
You can adapt to what the clients want, the particular genre of film. There's a lot of drama is going to sound different than horror that's going to sound different than comedy.
That's going to sound different from documentary.
Absolutely.
Sure.
Absolutely.
That's...
Another thing that we haven't really talked about, too, is just, noise reduction, cleaning stuff up. Are you doing more harm than good? Are you doing too much? And I think that for some of the listeners who haven't really done a lot, it's knowing that. It's a very fine line.
Yeah, I think
getting something cleaned up and something just sounding decimated.
Right. And
but clean.
There's a priority of just because you have the noise reduction tools to take away any background sound that could happen at all doesn't mean it's going to sound good like that.
No.
It's going to sound unnatural and in many cases watery or washy if you go too far.
Yeah, it's like a phaser's on it or something.
Yeah.
And that comes with experience, and talking to people and learning this craft is going out there and how would you do this? How would you do this? And then they tell you, and then you can adapt how you want to do it. What sounds good to you?
I think that's another, even just on the topic of noise reduction, I think that's sort of a big discrepancy between what you'd find in the TV or long-form workflow versus the advertising workflow. In advertising, you want the cleanest possible take because whatever it is that's being said may not correlate at all with what's being displayed in picture or what other sounds are going on. Where most of the time, if you have an episode of television where somebody's got a noisy line, you've got background sounds that are playing that you have something to kind of push that line into and let it live organically in that sort of soundscape. Yeah. Whereas again, in the advertising world, you might have all these big hits and slams and whooshes and then a huge dropout to emphasize whatever's going on. You don't necessarily want the sound of cars going by if you're working on a piece that's supposed to be set in the 1600s.
Yeah.
So where do you have a way to find that line?
Yeah, a lot of times you're doing a lot of work, and there's still the old adage, fix it in the mix. So even though people know that they're handing you super noisy, distorted, not prime dialogue,
some may say garbage.
That's
I believe is the term
mildly. That you're still expected. You got to make it sound the best you can by whatever means necessary. Sometimes, who knows? That might mean you go reread it ADR. Maybe maybe automating EQs, matching EQs, to other stuff. And sometimes you might even recommend putting another sound effect in there, if it isn't clean enough.
You're not even really aware of until you see somebody on a mix stage somewhere realize, oh, we don't have the perfect last syllable to finish this word off in any of our ADR takes or any of the takes from set. What do? We have a week to work on this before it needs to be delivered in airs.
You go record it.
A mixer would they literally have microphones on stage so that a mixer can go, oh, we need that syllable. We need, somebody didn't pronounce... Yep, we didn't pronounce the consonant here hard enough. We didn't get this K properly.
Yeah.
And they'll just record the performance themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, the number of times one of our mutual friends who works on the high level movies has gone in. We need some ADR that just makes the scene feel a little bit more alive. We need somebody's voice, some call out or something, just to give us some life in this background or this atmosphere. And he'll on the stage go and record himself doing whatever might be necessary for the scene and just layer it into the soundscape against everybody else.
Well, and that's also a fun opportunity.
Sure.
It's like backgrounds on a record where you would pull everybody out of the hallway, be like, hey, come here, help us. We got this call out or a chant or something like that. And all of a sudden, you're on a massive record, in the back going, yeah,
Sure.
something like that. So, I mean, those are the moments I think that can really make your day, week, month, year. When you're having fun stuff like that, you're collaborating.
Sure.
I think that those are the funnest days where you're going back and forth with your client and your input is valued and they like what you're doing, making musical changes, say, hey, I think this music bed would work better over here and we can reverse that. And
that's one of the most important components of really any workflow, but I think creative ones especially, and one that could certainly be emphasized more in the post-production aspect, is having that trust between the people you're collaborating with, where you may not know exactly, as a director or a video editor or a producer, you may not know exactly what you want to hear in a particular scene for a particular moment, but you have the trust in someone that you've worked with or someone that is professional enough to bring your vision to life. Mm-hmm. You can hand off to them and say, I know that I need something here. I don't quite know how to describe it. Do something cool. And have them translate kind of what that might mean. I know one of the guys that got me kind of started in this industry is named Scott Hecker. Scott has supervised all of Zack Snyder's films. And Zack was, when it came to Scott, and what he told me at least, was most of the time Zack had so many things going on that sound was one of those, hey, I know you, I trust you, make all this stuff really cool, and I'll see you in a little while when you've got enough of the work done that I can come in and hear it, and I'm going to be going and working on another whole set of films. And it would be months before he came back in and sat down with Scott to say, all right, what have you got? They had such a good workflow established and such a level of understanding that Scott and his team were able to translate all the stuff that a film needed. And Zack could come back and go, yeah, that's great. Fix this, do this differently. I like that, but everything else.
Well, trust. I mean, you earn a client's trust after, a certain amount of time. I mean, sometimes you don't. Sometimes, they're second guessing themselves, throughout their career, and you're never going to earn their trust because they don't trust themselves. But for the most part, if you go in there, put in the hard work, and you know what your client wants, you're going to be doing okay. Being decisive, making decisions. I think when we went and made the jump from analog to digital, from 24 tracks to unlimited tracks, there is a massive influx of indecisiveness in this industry where people aren't making decisions. You work with some people, they know exactly what they want.
Right.
And they're going to be able to make that decision. And I think as a mixer too, it's like pulling out the superfluous. We all know that if you layer 20 hits, it's going to sound bad. Go with a good one.
Yeah,
and boost that.
Pick one correct sound effect.
You're going to get phasing issues. It's just not going to sound big like you would think it is. And you're probably going to, distort the bus and whatnot. Decision making on any project is fundamental. It's, that I think is going to define whether you do good or not.
You're absolutely right. When it comes to the technologies and the abilities that we are afforded now as a result of them. It used to be you were very limited in what you could do, how many tracks you were working with, what sounds you had recorded, what sounds you could record, and how much time you had. Now there are even more time constraints, but the technology has afforded us this crazy, like you said, almost unlimited ability to just throw things together.
Yeah.
And with that has come the idea that, well, we can, so we should. We can use 300 tracks of audio at once, so we should. We just, of course, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We can use 17 different types of reverb, so we should.
A good friend of mine who passed away, Jerry Finn, he produced Blink-182, mixed Green Day's Dookie. He used to say if it doesn't fit on a 24 track, I don't have room for it. It's not important enough. And I always thought about that, and it was like, yeah, you know, it makes sense. Let's see what's important. What's important? What makes a spot? What's going to help tell the story in a song? What's gonna help with that? You know. Also, what effects are you using? What are clouding the dialogue? What's getting in the way? I learned, I think, mixing records with and for David Kahn, stripping the reverb off a vocal and going with, you know, a delay, a simple delay, rather than losing the presence with a ton of reverb, you know, making it swimming in all this verb.
Right.
And I think the same goes for post. If you're worried about all these effects and there's just this swimming bed, the dialogue isn't going to pop as much.
Right.
And I think it's, you know, in both post and music, you know, definitely getting presence out of the dialogue, getting presence out of the singer. You know, it's going to translate better. I think people are going to enjoy listening to it a lot more.
Right. And I mean, that's the primary storytelling device in any filmed content, whether it's something on YouTube or it's something in a theater somewhere. Dialogue typically is the backbone of everything. And so you want it
and the most poorly recorded.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And as with this, there are so many tools available to you out there to actually go through different microphones, different techniques, and things like that, you know, could really benefit someone who is serious about making YouTube videos.
Sure.
You know, where things aren't clipping, where, you know, you're not getting ground hum, you know, you're not getting a bunch of, you know, air conditioning, fan noise, that type of thing.
Right.
I guess if we're going to do anything correctly, it's like put the time in, put the effort, you know, set it up right.
Sure.
To make sure you get a clean recording. You know, you can add junk to it later. Taking it out is a lot harder.
How is it affected when you're adding too much stuff to it?
Well, I think keeping the integrity of a vocal or the dialogue. I mean, in the case of music, you're having a singer basically letting you into themselves, and they're telling you something.
You're trying to create an environment and capture the output in such a way that they can intimate something to you.
Yeah.
And not only is it your job as an engineer to make sure it's recorded properly and make sure it's recorded well, but create a space that they feel like they can do that comfortably.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, and the recording process is, you know, you're setting up something, as you said, environment, the whole recording environment. I mean, that could be many podcasts worth of material, and getting someone to feel like that they can pour their heart and soul out to you. And then, you know, your job is to capture that and do it justice.
Sure.
You know, and keep the integrity of that.
I find the most important investment you can make in a home studio environment when recording is a light on a dimmer switch.
Yes. Absolutely.
The amount that changes your ability to get...
Well, it's the all-important word, vibe.
Yep.
You know, what is a person, you know, the temperature, how do they feel, I hate to use this word, but safe in this space? What a concept.
Right.
You know, you can't really create that kind of environment on a movie set. You know, you could have someone on a aircraft carrier, you know, getting shot at. You know, that's going to be a little bit different. But
why, yes, I will be seeing Top Gun when it comes out.
You can still use great care in the treatment of that dialogue, in the way it's mixed and what you're using on it and how you're treating it.
Sure.
Are you doing more harm than good in your treatments? Are you making it clear and, you know, you can understand it, and you know, it's not getting stepped on by other things.
So what if the question is not too abstract, what makes good sounding dialogue to you? What makes good dialogue to you versus bad dialogue? Not just in a recording standpoint, but in terms of the actual sound of it when you would experience it in a theater.
I mean, having somebody on mic, you know, I would say is super important. As much as you can do that, boom operators are doing everything they were. The minute you start getting off access and off the mic, you're losing presence.
Sure.
It doesn't sound right.
Again, the example of having somebody dedicated to the craft of pointing a microphone in the right direction. Turns out it's a whole thing.
Oh, yeah. It's an art form in itself. You're probably trying to not get run over by cars and, dolly track and stuff like that.
Dealing with wind, dealing with all the other people around.
Yeah, just the job that they do is amazing. And then, you have films where most of it's re-recorded and it's ADR. And, well, how do we match that with production audio?
Right.
I mean, that's a whole nother episode in mixing, matching through EQ, through verb, through, dirtying it up a little bit, maybe a little distortion. There's a lot of tricks to do that, and making, production audio a lot cleaner too is like, all right, let's de-reverb this. Let's get de-humming and, de-crackling, things of that nature.
Sure.
To make it more pleasant so you can make it louder, more understandable.
Yeah, remove the harsher or less pleasant frequencies, or
absolutely
mitigate them downward enough that
notch those out.
When you boost everything overall,
correct,
it only gets the more, I guess, desirable stuff.
Right.
And being able to, I guess a lot of it is, again, having the understanding of what each frequency does. If you want to boost or cut top end because it's either too cutting and it sounds too sibilant, or it's just not bright enough and it doesn't feel airy enough, that translates across the board from post into music. You have
absolutely
notching frequencies out that sound more nasal or honky or something like that, versus featuring some of the low end, and that's what brings out the cinematic quality of a voice, is having a nice kind of treated bass resonance.
Yeah, and I mean, that's hard to accomplish. If somebody's got a boom mic out on a set, that you're not getting those frequencies that resonate throughout the chest, a lot of times. And it's like, well, how can we put those in there? How can we synthesize this dialogue to make it sound more pleasant, rewarding, warm?
I think one of the interesting things, I don't have as much of an opportunity to try this, only because I have the luxury of, for the most part, working with pretty well recorded dialogue most of the time, but being able to take a maybe poorly piece of recorded dialogue and roll off some of the low end and add like a subharmonic, a harmonic synthesizer or harmonic enhancer that will fill in or synthesize those lower resonant frequencies, and see how well that translates, see if I can play with that a little bit.
I think it might be Universal Audio, the voice of God. It's created by Little Labs. It's one of those.
Does exactly that.
Yeah, you can dial it in. Made by Jonathan Little.
Is it a better knob, like an Awesomizer kind of plug-in?
Pretty much. Pretty much. You can... That's a really good one. Yeah, there's all kinds of toys you can find that do that. I find that most guys in the industry are basically grabbing from the same bucket of plugins. Again, it's just how they use them.
Right.
And then you'll find within those, like, oh, this one really works well. And if it really does, then I think that's the overall feeling with most mixers is, yeah, that's a go-to tool.
Sure.
That's a really efficient and does more good than harm.
No, I was talking to one of the supervisors who used to do Battlestar Galactica a little while ago, and we were going back and forth about Isotope RX and specifically their Ambience Match module. And Ambience Match is really great for filling in space in between lines when you don't have anything else. You can't generate your own room tone. You can't create your own fill from production audio. But it's also, it's not the most amazing sounding thing in the world. I think it'll work in many cases, but for the kind of top quality, highest level of expectation, it only really gets you about 50 to 60% of the way there, and then you have to manipulate and add beyond that. But he was saying that he really doesn't use it for ambience matching at all because it just doesn't do what he wants, but it was great for extending car horns because you could take an output, instead of the ambience matching, you could output everything else without the ambience, and he could take a car horn that was maybe only a second long and he could extend it for 10 seconds because all that plug-in is, all that module is just a really specific sampler.
Hmm.
And then it generates or synthesizes, whatever you feed it, and creates an output that is as long as you want.
Right, from your selection.
Right. So again, I would never ordinarily think, as somebody who's using, cutting fill organically, or again having the luxury of not having to go and hunt and peck for that sort of stuff. He says, oh, I need to extend this car horn so it goes from one side of this take all the way to the other, and I don't have anything to actually do that with. I can't go and perform it and record it using a tool that is not really intended for that in an entirely different way.
That's interesting, and I that's the way creative minds work. Let's see what we can use this for.
Yeah.
Let's see what else this does. I'm not going to use it what it's designed for. That's in making records.
Sure.
It's like, here, let's use this for that on this.
That
let's
mentality.
See what it does.
Yeah, that mentality of, that's cool that it works, but let's see if we can break it.
Yeah, it's definitely kind of that pioneering aspect. The guys that came before me and the guys that came before those guys, let's move the mic around. Let's get it closer. Oh, really close. Or let's put it in another room, really crank up the gang and see what it does.
I think there's so much room for experimentation in sound in, well, all components, but in film and TV that may not be the most obvious things. And it's super logical to say, well, let's see what happens if we move a mic closer.
Yeah.
Let's see what happens if we, dial these plug-in settings differently. See what happens if we roll off all the top end and see how this feels.
Yeah, I think in those worlds, definitely like episodic and feature world compared, you would have time to do that.
Sure.
In the making of the episode or feature. Marketing, not so much. Again, that goes back to, well...
Do all this on a deadline,
Yeah,
too.
This is what we've got. Can we hear the mix in 20 minutes? But if you go out and you actually mess around with sound, you go record some stuff, fool around with it, then, you get those chops. You have those in your bag of tricks. So you can easily just pop them out. And, that's up to the individuals getting out there, experimenting, messing around with stuff.
Are there things that you think maybe picture editors in more of a marketing function or more of sort of the fast-paced advertising function? Are there things that you think they could do that would save both them and you time or headache at the very least when it comes to sound?
Basic mixing concepts and how they layer their sound effects. Obviously, most spots that come through on an AAF need to be brought down 20 dB. Everything is just cranked so much. Right. I think that, layering plugins, don't do it. Unless you're really making a sound and it's not just trying to make a bigger boom.
Right.
Find a big boom. They're out there. They're out there. You can find them. You
With the right amount of perseverance.
Yeah, you don't need 30 of them. But then you get into people using and getting stuck on specific libraries. As you alluded to earlier, in managing a library, sometimes people are using some old stuff and they really like that stuff because it's their stuff.
Sure.
And they don't want to break away from that. That's hard. Getting someone to try something new is hard. But with what we do, you have to be open to that. You're never going to move forward. It's like, that's why I learned Pro Tools. That's why I learned Logic. I want to go forward. I don't want to be the engineer that isn't getting hired anymore because he doesn't know how to edit.
Right.
And can't work around a computer. And even today, it's the mixer engineer is almost a thing of the past because you need a mixer, engineer, editor / producer all in one.
Right.
And that's where things really went, is that you got to be all those guys in one.
For no pay.
For no pay. No glory, nothing. And then you move into the post world, and that's what we do as re-recording mixers for marketing spots. We're doing everything. We do have the luxury of having a producer, but, and you have an editor who's like, well, this is my vision for this spot. And you want to keep that, but, in complying with the COM Act and LKFS and all that, it's not always possible, and you have to dip, you got to take something away to put something back in.
Sure.
Yeah.
when it comes to mixing, when it comes to re-recording mixing specifically, the music side mixing is sort of an ongoing part of the process. You're making decisions as you're tracking. You're making decisions as you're creating this soundscape of whatever song, as you're developing said soundscape. When it comes to mixing, you're at the end of the pipeline entirely. So you're kind of inheriting all of these different creative choices and deliberate specific things that a creative had in mind versus maybe some of the mistakes along the way that you end up having to fix. And you end up having to work with totally different people all the time as well. Is there anything that, for people who are cutting things themselves and having to do sort of this single person one-stop shop of they're editing video, they're having to throw in sound effects, is there anything you think they could do to make maybe their lives a little bit easier, or to bring up the level of quality in the content they're working on?
I would say be mindful when you're recording. Don't record too hot. Maybe if you can, have a couple of different microphones recording. If you can, record a couple of tracks, to get cleaner. Just the cleaner the dialogue, if the piece is going to have dialogue, make that your focus. That's as important as the lighting. That's, if your picture is beautiful and wonderful, but the audio stinks, I mean, it's amateur.
Right,
it's like you want to up your game. So I would say learning that craft a little bit, what production audio, checking out videos on that. I would say, keeping your timeline clean, keeping effects on effects tracks, music on music tracks, dialogue, narration, everything separate and well organized. That's going to help the mixer work quicker. I know, let's just say, I don't know a mixer who wouldn't appreciate that. I think we all want to be able to quickly find, problematic sound effects and stuff like that pretty quickly. And if they're buried in with the music, or crossfaded in with dialogue, that's going to cause problems.
Sure. I think the level of organization, can translate from, if you're cutting together a YouTube video and you're working with 4 tracks of video and 4 tracks of audio, and you just need to stay a little bit organized, those same principles in how you would organize that will still apply when you're working on a 2,000 track wide session for, John Wick 3 or something.
Yeah.
If you've got a particular set of sounds that you're going to be repeating over the course of your entire, filmed content, put them on the same track if you can.
Consistency in our business goes a long way. From if you're engineering, a drum session, you're recording drums. If you're consistent in your sounds, people take notice and people are going to hire you again. They know we can get a quality sound with this guy. Same with someone throwing together, a video. It's like consistency is key in how you do things from one project to the next. How you organize, how you mix, how, it's just key to take accountability for, the workflow.
Sure. And having that established where, almost taking the time to study workflow in its own light. How do you optimize? How do you, maybe there are things you're doing 150 times a day that are just the exact same operation. Can you figure out a way to do that more quickly? Can I use quick keys? Can I use shortcuts? Can I, can I automate part of this process?
Absolutely. How deep can I go with that to make me more efficient?
That's one of the defining lines, I think, for me, was seeing somebody who was working with macros and hotkeys in a dialogue session. These are things that I immediately think of the gaming world. The people who are playing World of Warcraft and League of Legends have their crazy gaming keyboards that have all the macros that make their characters do, whatever it is. We've got all those same abilities when it comes to something like Pro Tools or something like DaVinci Resolve or Premiere. They've got their hotkeys built in, but there are softwares that you can literally just make a string of commands and map it to a particular keystroke, and it'll do 10 things at once for you and save you those 10 keystrokes every single time you need them.
I use them every day. They make my life very easy.
I remember when I first came to Los Angeles, I was lucky enough to connect with the dialogue editor who did Mad Men. And I went over to his place, and he's got a really nice home setup, and he was showing me kind of the ins and outs of dialogue editorial. And I remember him saying, well, I need to clean up this line in Isotope, and they don't want me to go too far on this particular show at all, so I just want to get a couple of little clicks and pops out. And this was back in the day before Isotope had its integration with DAWs, where you could just click a button, and it would send it round trip into Isotope RX standalone, and then it would send it round trip back to Pro Tools. That didn't exist at all.
Yeah.
So I knew that at the time, and I sat down, was really interested, and what are you going to do? And he hit a hotkey, and in Pro Tools version 8, where this ability didn't exist, and in Isotope version 3, where this ability didn't exist, he round-tripped audio into Isotope with, I don't know, like 30 different steps, and it took all of 2 seconds. Wow. And I went, oh my God, what is this? I have to have this. I don't understand what you just did. And he went, oh yeah, it's this little piece of software over here. And I've been relying on it ever since.
And I think that's the same audio that you hipped me to that I use ever since.
That is precisely true.
So it's really just paramount that you have tools like that. I mean, because if you are, as you said, if you're doing 150 times the same thing every day, and you can cut off 10 minutes.
Sure.
That's a long time. 10 minutes is a lot of time in marketing. That's a lot of deadline coming quicker, so.
And you tally that up over the course of a year every single day. That's plenty of time saved that you could either be doing other things or spending more time creatively on something instead of getting hung up on technical details.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the biggest principle in working in a technological world, is figuring out how to get the technology out of the way enough that you can translate creative ideas. And
I think that's always been the goal, is to get the technology out of the way and create. I would have to go back where I was an assistant engineer, Conway Studios, on Marilyn Manson's Mechanical Animals. Yeah. Michael Beinhorn was the producer, Barry Goldberg, Sean Bevan were engineers. I was the assistant. Probably the biggest recording endeavor I had been on. Had a couple of guitar techs, drum tech, Pro Tools. We had 2-inch tape, 33, 48 track, half-inch digital. I think we had about a 20,000 watt PA in the live room, pumping kick and snare back out there while we recorded.
Good Lord.
I had never been on a record where we had the time to go through 100 snare drums. Instead of grabbing a quick EQ or a compressor, we would move the mic around. That was, Barry Goldberg out there, getting blasted all day, moving mics around. I'd be out there, Sean Bevan. And we would have lights that would shake loose from the ceiling, smash on the ground because of all the low end going there.
And you've all been deaf ever since.
Yeah, we had two drum setups, and we would just move all the mic pre's over to the other kid and back, and it was a lot of work. But at the end of the day, if you thought you were jumping through a bunch of hoops, but then you'd get through that last hoop, and it was like, okay, this sounds perfect, and we'd record it. And that really taught me a lot, that when you're chasing a sound, when you know what you want, that you got to keep going for it. You got to keep going and getting it. And I mean, we had, pipe and drape over the console where you couldn't see. We had minor lights on. There were so many Moog synths. A wonderful, wonderful experience. Same with guitar heads and bass amps and stuff like that. I mean, it was like we really did. We went through everything. And that was a really special, that really got me pumped to record. That reinvigorated me as an assistant to be like, oh my God, we can do all this. We can try all these different mics. We can try all these different setups going through this rig to this rig. And I think what was really changing to me is just moving mics around. Going backwards. We had every EQ available to man, but actually moving the mic around. That was very interesting.
That's the exact same thing applies in the sound effects recording world. Obviously a different
come at it from different angles and stuff like that. Yeah. And I learned so much from Sean and Michael and Barry. And it was fun too. We had a lot of crazy characters come down to the studio.
One can only imagine.
From, Johnny Depp to Leif Garrett to David Spade to various others. It was a good time. It was, what you thought making records should be. It was that. And we were working, sometimes we'd work, I think a 20-hour day was a pretty normal day. And then we might take Sunday off. But there were days we were working 37 hours straight.
Oof.
You'd get delirious with laughter because you were so tired. But that's, to me, I still think it's one of Manson's best records. And I was proud to be part of that, That was a good time.
Sure. How long were you in the studio with that?
I think we were at Conway for a few months. Sometimes I wouldn't leave for a week or so. Just better to grab some winks there than go home.
Sure.
But yeah, we worked on that for that was a good run. Yeah. I can't go into all the stories.
I know. I'm so sad about that.
But the band was great. The production, everybody on the production side was awesome. It was a good time. I'll never forget we were at Conway and so delirious with laughter. I think Barry Goldberg and I were on these. They had hammocks out there, and I had somehow gotten tangled up like a fish in a net. And
Naturally.
Couldn't get out, and we just laughed for about an hour. It was great.
I can just picture you out in a hammock for an hour straight, just hysterically laughing. Yeah, that's.
But also, learning miking techniques from these guys. That was a big learning experience for me. Trying to make sure everything's patched correctly. And when you're working on no sleep, that was a tall order at times.
Yeah, really. Here, do this very simple task that literally anyone with a brain could do.
Yeah, and we also we spent a lot of time working on like the bias, the alignment on the tape machines to get it to have the sound that Michael wanted.
Which I think now pretty much anybody who manipulates bias on a tape machine is manipulating it in a plugin from Waves.
Yeah, I don't really know how that works. I don't think it sounds the same.
Imagine that.
Yeah.
It turns out the only way to get tape sound is to use tape.
Yeah. And if you want to record a toilet flushing, the only thing to do is put a condom on a 57, tape it up, and drop it in there.
That is not the sentence I expected to receive, but quite frankly, yeah, it's about right.
Yeah, and other things.
I don't want to talk about that. So that's all the time we've got. Thanks, Rob, for coming down and hanging out, chatting for a little bit. I think this is sort of a unique perspective because not many people have worked at the level of music that you have and then have transitioned into the level of post-production and seen both sides of the fence. And it's fascinating to hear differences and similarities between both and a lot of the workflow that translates and a lot of it that might not necessarily. They're definitely unique worlds unto themselves.
Anytime.
Much appreciated. Until next time, I'll see you around the studio.
Yeah, I'll see you at work.